Today's podcast is sponsored by TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is an online software for coaches and trainers, and I've continued to hear great things about the TeamBuildr platform. If you're looking for either an in-house training portal for your training groups or an online training hub, be sure to check out the TeamBuildr training software. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. We have on the show today sports performance coaches Rich Burnett and John Garrish. Rich is the president and director of athletic development for Triple F Sports Training in Knoxville, Tennessee. He's also the co-founder and CEO of Athletic Assessment Technology, known more commonly as the Plyomat. Rich has over 10 years of experience working in both the high school and the NCAA Division I strength and conditioning settings. John Garrish is the director of athletic development and performance at North Broward Prep School in Coconut Creek, Florida. He's also the school's head track and field coach. So with that combined strength and then track and field training experience, John has been a two-time guest on this podcast, speaking on a variety of plyometric and speed training topics. So for the episode today, we'll be talking about plyometric training in light of reactivity. Oftentimes in assessing an athletic performance program, we will look at standing vertical jump. A standing vertical jump, although a great test of general explosive power, does not factor in ground contact time. It doesn't factor in how long it took you to produce that force. And there are much better markers out there in terms of transfer to explosive athleticism, sprint times, jump abilities that do factor in ground contact time that we can use not only to assess athletes, but also to use those principles in how we lay out our plyometric program. So that's going to be what we're getting into today. Rich and John have some awesome ideas with athletic assessment based on ground contact time and plyometrics, training ideas, training correlations based off reactive strength indexes, and more. We'll be getting a lot into single versus double leg reactive strength as well, which is a really important point to touch on. This was an awesome podcast, a great way to level up your plyometric knowledge. And I really enjoyed talking to Rich and John here for the episode today. So let's get to podcast 375 with Rich Burnett and John Garrish. Well, hey, I know in honor of Labor Day weekend, Rich, you were just mentioning something about fishing, like things that are the opposite of strength and conditioning athletic performance. John, I'm curious, what do you do when you're not coaching? Like, what's your reset button?
I'm a big beach water guy for sure. Not necessarily fishing, but being in South Florida, it's easy to do all year round. And it's been interesting in the past years. I feel like podcast listening, book reading, like show watching, I try to get actually more further away from strength and conditioning and track and field, not because I don't love it and not because it's no longer a passion, simply because I find it a little bit easier to turn off, which is nice, So I'd say definitely the easy answer is I like to go just hang out at the beach and try not to think about anything. That's the easiest way for me to turn off. That's what I plan on doing with the rest of the Labor Day once we're finished up here. That's my love.
Yeah, fishing for you, Rich.
What is now, man? I mean, I grew up saltwater fishing right off the coast. Hop on the Yeti with a silver spoon and catch a few things. It's pretty convenient. The beach is 10 minutes from my house, close to what John's experiencing now in South Florida. But now I got a little John boat that I got a decent deal on Facebook Marketplace, of course, and got two boys, 8 and 5. So it's easy just to toss them in there, man, and take the boat down 10 minutes to a really nice boat launch that's surrounded by mountains and trees. I mean, and it's pretty quiet out there. It's a beautiful spot. So Knoxville has its perks, and that's what I was told when I was persuaded to move here. So, and it's paying off, man. I mean, it's a beautiful, serene area for sure. So yeah, we're loving it. We're just getting started though. So I'm by no means a real angler, but I'm getting there.
Yeah. I've never had luck fishing, sadly. never had luck. Well, hey, let's talk about RSI here. So reactive strength. Before we get, I guess, too far or right into it, maybe we can start with definitions. I know I had the Just Jump mat forever back in the day, and there was the 4-jump test. And it's funny, it took me a long time to figure out what that middle number was. And the 4-jump test, they would give me 3 numbers. It's like, oh, you got 2.8 or 3.1. And then I finally figured it was air time divided by ground time, or that function. So tell me a little bit about, first what RSI is, or reactive strength is, and then we can get a little bit, or maybe then we'll talk about how you use it in your programming. So what is your, how does it find itself into your plyometric and speed training programming?
So I'll take a lead on this, John, and just kind of brief history of RSI and my experience. And then because John naturally started and I connecting on RSI kind of later on as our relationship started to grow just naturally through the NHSSCA and things. But I mean, it was about 8 or 9 years ago when I borrowed the Just Jump mat from the kinesiology department at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi, and was using it as just a quicker way to test verticals, than the Vertec that we had. And switching over to 4 jump mode and jumping on it, and was like, what is this middle number? So the same story, Joe, like,
yeah.
what is this number? What does it mean? I started asking questions, started like testing athletes on it. And there really isn't much literature from Just Jump and Paul Macabjack, who created it in, 1991 and when it first hit the market anyway. And he called it explosive leg power factor, ELPF. And if you still had the old manual or went to the Probotics website, you'd find, some information on it. But essentially, he figured out, whether it was through some other, kinesiology type person, or just kind of on his own as a mechanical engineer and electrical engineer, that, I can actually find out this other quality about an athlete, not just their vertical and displacement, but actually how they interact with the ground. And so I think the word explosive gets used most often by the layperson, which is honestly who Paul was, having an engineering background, because it helps us identify if an athlete's explosive, they're just pushing away off the ground very well and very efficiently and very powerfully. So like we try and think of words to describe what that is, and as educated kinesiologists, we know that to be elasticity or stretch shortening cycle or stiffness. We have so many ways for us to even define it, but the layperson will always say, "Man, that athlete is really explosive," and then it's their legs. Explosive leg power factor is what Paul had come up with on that, and we ended up having a relationship. He and I, just kind of as an advisory role for me whenever I moved to Atlanta, and convinced Gary Schofield when we were both at GEC to, that we had to continue down this path for me of measuring this quality in all of our athletes. Because I was just leaving Texas A&M Corpus Christi when I really just went deep dive into RSI, and which is what I began to understand it once I did more research. But essentially, Paul and I started kind of have a relationship, and he donated formats to our school. He would travel from Huntsville to come see me. And it was pretty cool just to hear stories of guys he had tested, and girls. I'm sure he tested all kinds of athletes on this thing in the early 90s. But Dennis Rodman was the one that always stuck out to me, as he said having one of the highest 4-jump pogo scores. And it was like in the 3.6s or 3.7s or something crazy, on the 4-jump. So all the 4-jump listeners out there, that's kind of off the charts. And so, just like you said, though, Joel, by definition, using that piece of technology as well as the Plyomat now, it's simply whatever protocol you choose: 1 jump, 4 jump, 10 jumps. The Scandinavian rebound test consists of, multiple jumps as well, but it's flight time divided by contact time. It's really that simple.
Yeah.
And
sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. First off, I appreciate Rich being here with me, because, these are oftentimes questions that I lean on Rich for the answer to. But I think he hit it on the head with that last point. Is it's basically a calculation. So I relied on him largely with this technology to be able to apply that calculation and find kind of the simplest ways possible to work it in our weight room, work it in our strength sessions, working in our speed sessions out on the track or turf. And that's pretty simply how we use it. I like to keep things pretty simple. I understand it as a calculation, and it's a calculation that helps us kind of move the needle of our program and understand our athletes a little bit better.
Yeah. So, John, maybe I'll start with you then, just turning this around into, well, how does it find its way into programming? I know we've talked a lot in previous podcasts about like skips, gallops, which all by nature are very reactive things. How does it shake down in your program? And do you use it like kind of as a priming, like a teaching part, testing? Like, tell me a little bit in light, especially too, of all the reactive stuff that we talked about last time with those things. I'm curious how it lands in your programming and how your athletes are experiencing that feedback.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, to be honest. Easy way to answer that. Prior to using RSI, I think it was something that simply we guessed with. We understood like some athletes look bouncy, some athletes look explosive, look twitchy, whatever kind of blanket term you want to use. And we didn't have a way to easily identify or quantify it. So as a track and field coach, one of the main points for me or one of the main differences, I guess I saw it in at least like talent identification on our campus was many of the students. So we used the first time, I think we used RSI because once I received the first plyomat, Rich, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we were in like the center of the pandemic. It was definitely 2020, maybe early one. I could be wrong on that, but I know for sure that we weren't on campus. So I didn't have like a large number of students to work with. A lot of things were tested. I used it myself. So when we brought it to campus, I think the very first time that we used the plyomat and used these features to calculate RSI was as basically an identification for our track and field tryout. The way that we run our program, we don't necessarily cut student athletes or students from our team, but we identify what event or area that they might find some success in. RSI provided a lot of value, certainly to the sprinters, but especially, Joel, I love the triple jump, and triple jump was like the primary thing that happened that year. We also happened to have a lot of success at the state level. Those athletes that had this high level of success at the state level, go figure, showed some of the most impressive RSI values. So yeah, kind of looking at it from a skill identification through testing, but also from a development standpoint, testing over time if you're not assessing or guessing, as a training tool as well, just in priming activities, whether it be before our track practice or before something we've got going in the weight room for a lift. There's a wide range of ways that we've used RSI for our students.
Cool. I'm curious too with the priming particularly. I know for the testing, back when I had the just jump, it would be test basically with track and field. I would just, for the most part, switch off the 4 jump and a counter movement jump every other week, so just not to get stale or whatnot. And
sure.
But I think that I also did have a contact time back when that the just jump had a contact function, because at some year it stopped having that, which really frustrated me once I got the second iteration of it. And I would use it for like hurdle hops. I would put it after, like if it was like a series of 6 hurdles, I would put it in between maybe the 3rd and 4th hurdle or something, just so people had an idea of what their times were. And it was, I never really had hard numbers. It was just kind of a feedback tool in the sense of, I think I would say, hey, try to be under 0.2 here on these hurdle hops if you can. And these days, more of where I've gone to is, because you said priming, and I've gone to the place where I try to do more of the warm-up jumps in a series with a priority on lower contact times, and then let it unload into normal or longer contact time type situation. And I've done a lot of that just organically too, not necessarily with a contact mat, but just say, hey, try to be quick off the ground for this series. That's the priority. And then once the height of the hurdle or the bar or something goes up, then you can self-organize more. But I'm just curious, when you mentioned priming, I'm curious how that shakes out for what you're looking at with your athletes with plyometrics or speed or power.
Yeah, that's a pretty valid example. Or if we have a speed day on the track or on the turf, once we finish our general and specific prep, basically I like to include some form of plyo. So we discussed in great detail in the past on some gallops and skips and hops. And one of the things that I remember always resonated with me is just kind of emphasizing speed through those movements. And the thought process is, again, preparing the student athlete for what the session is going to look like. And in a priming in the weight room instance, maybe where we're doing just multiple hops before, a set on back squat or whatever, insert any movement. I think it's an opportunity to fill a bucket that might be something that we're missing in the weight room as well. So I think it checks a lot of boxes. I think when we're out on the field or out on the turf, it prepares the body, it prepares those foot contacts for what we want them to be or what we want to set them up for success in. And then when we're in the weight room, it might be something probably that we're missing out on, that speed component. No matter how fast we're moving the bar, no matter what movement we're doing with load on our backs, we're probably not going to be moving in a way and preparing the body in the way that some of those multiple hops and emphasizing ground contact will.
Yeah, Rich, how does it shake out into your program for like the applied usage in like a typical plyometric session?
Yeah, so one of my favorite analogies I use for my kids to, especially my like really young kids, 12, 13, 14 years old, who are not track athletes, who don't really understand how to use the ground well, who have never really done structured plyometrics and known how to organize their body when they're trying to push off the ground explosively, is with talking about a basketball. So I mean, there's nothing worse than going to the basketball gym, looking through the ball cage and grabbing a flat ball. Like you grab the flat ball, you try and bounce it, and it's just like there's nothing to it. It doesn't bounce at all. You're trying to dribble or take a shot, and it's just kind of ruins your day. You know, as you guys were talking about priming, like the human body sometimes, a lot of times, especially with us three, you know, if we were to go do some plyo workout right now, we'd probably have to inflate ourselves. We'd probably have to prime our nervous system to the extent to where we're actually like able to be bouncy. So I use that analogy a lot with the kids of like, as you do this one drill of hopping off this box and immediately trying to get back on, like your core and everything needs to be one system to truly stiffen up at the right time as you're contacting the ground, like an inflated basketball. Like we want this basketball to be full of air. We want your core to be quote unquote full of air and stiff in your spine. We don't want to collapse, you know, as we contact the ground. We want to come right back onto the box. And it's amazing what that will do to just help a kid understand the proprioceptive aspect of it. It's like, here comes the ground, and at the right time, I pop back on. The best athletes in the world, you don't have to explain that to. You don't even have to go down that rabbit hole. Like they'll hop off and hop back on. It just comes natural to them. And so most true athletes that I work with, I don't necessarily have to do a lot of that. They still need to be primed to some extent in terms of like a decent warm up of some dribbles or bounds or, you know, anything before like a good speed workout. But it's just cool to really know and identify that some kids, you know, not only do they need to be brought awareness to how this type of plyometric and reactive strength activity works, but how in the role that their core and everything else plays to quote unquote stiffen up at the right time. But they also, some athletes just truly aren't even capable of it. I mean, you got these, you know, 300-pound offensive linemen that are 16, 17 years old, and they don't realize how important it is to actually like use the ground and be explosive and have fast feet. And the difference between the ones that get a scholarship and the ones that don't are the ones that are just kind of in the way. They're just big, slow, you know, their feet don't move fast. They don't use the ground well. Whereas the big explosive ones, man, they're as agile really as an athlete half their size. And a lot of that just is a reactive strength thing. So yeah, as far as how it plays into our programming, it simply helps me further identify what type of plyos an athlete is ready for. I mean, just to be honest, everything I do kind of goes upwards progressively with a lot of the population I work with. And so like if I see an athlete just crumbling on a particular plyo drill that's way too advanced, then we're going to scale that back, lower the box height if it's a kind of a quick speed box hop, lower the hurdle height. I mean, it's anything that any of us would do because their reactive strength abilities aren't in line with the size of even their frame, or they're just not getting it. They're just not stiffening up at the right time. So,
yeah. So with the RSI and or the reactive strength, I know, and I've seen this. I think Dan Bach had mentioned something about this, and I've seen this as well. Like a double leg reactive strength versus a single leg. And I know, Rich, we've talked about single leg beforehand, but I know with the fore jump, like when I had my best just jump fore jump, so two legs, like bilateral jumping. I was getting a pretty good score at my age 24. I was at 3.44, so I was getting up there. I think it was like, you know, a just jump listed average was 30 inches, and then the ground contact was like 0.21. Of course, it's not 30 inches each jump, but that year with high jump, though, you'd think, oh, that was, if I was the best at that, wouldn't my high jump be the best, or my triple jump? And it wasn't. I don't think I was as fast in sprinting that year either than I'd been in the past. But single leg, you had talked about that, Rich. And then, you know, John, I was going to ask you a bit more with the talent ID of like a single leg reactive strength testing, or assessing one's like basically single leg hopping ability as kind of a gold standard of athleticism. So I'd be really curious to hear what you guys have to say about the double versus single leg piece when it comes to actually measuring someone's power output in that situation.
but I'll comment real quick because I've been doing it a lot, and I know John probably hasn't done it formally. You know, to the extent that I have with truly just doing it a bilateral repeat pogo test and a single leg RSI test that I've just instituted at Triple F since we opened almost a year ago. And it's really interesting to know that just because an athlete's good at bilateral does not mean they're good at unilateral, and vice versa. So one of our best pogo kids on the 5-hop is what I do with the plyomat. I mean, he's slow and he's not very good at the single leg one. So, and then I have athletes that are just like, oh, like I just know who they are. I know the type of player that they are. You know, they're one of the best athletes in Knoxville type of thing. And when they hop in the plyomat, they're just hopping and floating. And it just kind of assumes that, like, all right, they're going to do really well in this test because they're explosive, they can make plays. But it's just not always the case. I mean, when you get to kind of that run-of-the-mill athlete, that's not quite the elite one, but somewhere in the middle, you know, it's interesting, all the kinds of stuff I see. But I have for sure noticed with a single leg RSI 1-hop, which is from my left foot forward to my left, pop, get as high as I can, land on 2. I got a video that I can show you and that
I could put in I could show it in the show notes for people who can be directed there.
It's just a protocol that I just adopted and went with, one that we've talked about, Joel, one that John and I surely have spitballed it around at some point, and just like, hey, I just want to see vertical displacement quickly off of the left foot, land on 2, and that has had a huge correlation with my population of kids with speed on every split, not just the top speed split, which I thought it would be more on the kind of more elastic part of the sprint, but it's also been in the early phases, the 0 to 5 and the 5 to 15. So with a totally different population, I'm sure there's more of a shift to where the elastic part shows out more in the back end. But also keep in mind that this test is not a repeat test. If it was a repeat test, I'm sure it would be a lot more indicative of the kind of the top end of the speed of the sprint. But because it's that one-off, just pop off my left, land on 2, pop off my right, land on 2, and I averaged both together. It's been really interesting to see what it tells me and what it doesn't tell me. I mean, to be honest, like it's a separate quality in and of itself that a lot of these untrained kids just need to improve upon, as well as everything else. It doesn't always have that super strong correlation because they're missing other general qualities. They're not very strong. And so it's okay that that's not making that direct connection yet because they have so much that they need to work on. So
yeah, I would have loved to see how Dennis Rodman did his 4-jump test, like what his strategy was and things like that. I think about, well, even with what you said there, Rich, I even think about the differences between that. Like if it's a single leg reactive strength where you're starting off of the mat and then you jump on it, right? Is that how you do it, where you start off and then you get a little horizontal movement into it?
And I have to cue the kids carefully a little bit because I don't want them to jump onto the mat. Like I want them to push forward into it, so I tell them like, you're like a skipping stone, like go forward, shoot forward into it and then pop off like you would like a penultimate step on a when I'm trying to take horizontal energy into a vertical displacement. But a lot of them, they'll like jump up onto it first. I'm like, no, that's too much energy to deal with. Just it's hard enough as it is. Go forward, left to left and right to right. So that kind of normalizes across the board when they have to start from their left and go to left versus right to left. That would probably be a totally different output on that. But repeat single leg stuff, I actually built that into the plyomat as a protocol. I haven't done a lot of it and collected a ton of data on it yet, but I'd want to. But that's where we're at, just generally speaking, with RSI. Like it's a science overall with this metric, and we're learning that there's so many more variables than we would have loved to thought when we first discovered it. But getting more and more data on more and more different populations is going to be just so helpful for all of us across the board. So, but we have to take the time to do it, consistently and in a structured environment to find out exactly what it's telling us.
Yeah, I was just saying with the horizontal, I do think there's something to having some horizontal amplitude in the test versus it being purely vertical, just because if it's completely vertical, it is a little bit less representative of motions in sport that use like horizontal into vertical, or there's like angular rolling actions. Or I think about like if you're just doing like single leg hopping or single leg jumping where you're kind of cycling the foot up a little bit and covering horizontal ground, the way the ankle works is actually quite a bit different than if you were just in place going up and down and you weren't covering any horizontal ground. And it's more athletic when you have a little bit. It feels easier too. Like if you're just to stand on one leg and you start jumping on one leg and moving forward, there's a feeling of ease with that that's actually much easier than if you're doing it vertically. And I think it's because, again, it's that conversion. It almost allows a little bit even more elasticity, where I think if it's just pure vertical, it's almost a little bit more, it's not like night and day, but I think it's a little bit more muscular. But I was thinking with the bilateral, like if I'm doing an in place, hopping up and down, it's interesting to think of the strategies athletes can use to try to be good at that. One of which I was really good at, which was internally rotating both knees together a little bit because I'm already internally rotated. And then using a lot of upper body whip, just like this huge upper body whip, internal rotation. But that's not what like a sprint stride looks like. It's not even what like a high jump takeoff looks like. There might be a lot of upper body whip, but you're not going to get that huge level of internal rotation that's facilitated by being bilateral or standing two leg on the ground. It's a different world once you're on one foot. And I think that's really cool, because I do think, people would say like, hey, yeah, there's not, like Dan Bucket said, hey, the fore jump, if you're great at the fore jump, it doesn't mean you're going to be fast. But I do think on the flip side, and Dan might have mentioned this, if you're fast, that probably is a good sign for the fore jump for the most part. And there is skill in the fore jump, but it's almost like with that, it's almost like a reverse correlation where things that are single leg and faster will transfer to more stuff. Things that are bilateral and slower have a greater chance of being specific unto themselves. So yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll comment on that with John. When he first started adopting a true RSI test, of course, you can pick 1,000 different protocols, right? But he decided to go with a more forward kind of jump from one mat to another mat. So that's how he formally tested all his kids when he was talking about the trial. I'll let him comment on that.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing that.
For track and field group, that makes total sense. Anything that even kind of resembles the gait cycle in general from a forward standpoint. I've also had a lot of success with the lateral test with physical therapists that we work with to kind of look at, is an athlete ready for return to play, laterally speaking? And he's adopting that now with a lot of his clients. So, and that feels very natural. Like when I'm doing that lateral test, like it feels so much better than the single leg forward hop. So that is the question. It's like, can we still make sure we choose the test that we don't have to sit there and like belabor the athlete to really do the right way and find the right strategy by us telling them, but rather they can kind of naturally find that strategy on their own. I think that's what John experienced with the forward two hop, over a hurdle, right, John? I think it was like a set height.
Exactly. Yeah, we would just use mini hurdles. And the first one, I actually didn't use the mini hurdle. So athlete was standing off the mat. We had two mats, and athletes starting off the mat. Basically, like something that we use is a little hop, big jump in our training on a weekly basis, or at least depending on the time of year and who we have. So I wanted to find a way to kind of quantify that. So a way that we were able to do it, and it kind of introduced some of that horizontal component, was an athlete would start off of, we had two mats, one mini hurdle. So mat, mini hurdle, mat. The athlete would actually start behind or in front, whichever way your context is. The first mat, they would take a little hop onto the first mat. I would tell them to be as quick as possible off that first mat, and a big jump, pretend the hurdle's 10 times the height, jump as high as humanly possible, spend a lot of time in the air, and land on the second one. The mats, it's not like the mats were a wide, distance apart, but there was still a horizontal component to it that I think was beneficial. That was something that we used, but I kind of wanted to touch on the double leg versus single leg in my community, and who I see working at a high school, working with Speed School, which is a training program for students from 6 years old to 26 years old, and all different levels. At the high school level, obviously it's a little bit more condensed than that, but still we have future collegiate triple jumpers and athletes, like I mentioned, that we won't cut from our track and field program. So in many ways, we'll be going through the same training program. And I think one of the things that I noticed early on with our RSI testing was I needed to be really selective of volume, because number one, we have a hard track surface. Number two, some of the testing might have been either, we had the mat as a little bit of a buffer of the ground, but sometimes we would do that testing out on the sidewalk, just off to the side of the track. Sometimes we would do that testing in the weight room. That it would irritate shins a little bit. So I decided that easy decision. We needed to be really selective of volume there. So speaking from generality, going from general to specific, what I found was that I still saw quite a bit of value in a bilateral RSI testing. Basically, our primary assessment would be the one that I just mentioned. And much of our alternating or single leg plyos, I wanted to happen in a more realistic way out on the track or out on the turf. So that's where we did a lot of our skips and gallops. And that was kind of where I saw a different method of plyometric being very applicable, again, in our track and field setting. We've got students from all sports. So that was where I kind of wanted to use it. And we saw a lot of success that way. I wish there was a way to quantify truly ground contacts of those type of movements. Obviously, that would be nice. But being able to simply either measure them, we've talked about in great detail, Joel, on skips for speed and gallops for speed, whether it be race or thinking quicker ground contacts, but you can also assess those for distance. And generally, if I found an athlete that could perform, be at our highest values from an RSI standpoint and be at a high value, whether it be power skips for distance and measuring that, whatever it may be, that was obviously going to be an athlete that we knew was going to succeed on the runway, but probably was also one of our better athletes on campus, regardless of sport.
Supplements may not be the core of a total nutrition and human performance program, but they can really support and enhance the process. On the level of supplements, Lost Empire Herbs has been my go-to for the last 5 years. As someone who's constantly observing nature in motion to help me understand movement better, so too do I draw from nature in my supplementation regime. If you want to check out some of my favorite supplements for energy, strength, and enhancing the total impact of your training regimen, things such as Shilajit, which has been well recommended by many strength coaches, the Phoenix Formula, which was my original Lost Empire Herbs supplement that really made me a believer in the power of herbalism, things like pine pollen, mushroom tinctures, and more, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can use the code JOEL15, that's JOEL15 for 15% off your order. Definitely check out Lost Empire Herbs. They're an awesome company and will really help that total aspect of your performance training process. Yeah, I was going to say with that's one of the questions I had kind of brewing in my head was like dynamic tests that can kind of be a single leg RSI test in and of themselves. Like if someone is really good at 10 power skips for distance or, gallops for distance or gallops for speed or however you want to measure those things that are in them of themselves, they're relatively simple. I mean, I would assume that those athletes who are achieving the highest scores on those tests, especially too, because to skip and gallop, it's rhythm, but it's also, there's a quickness to the rhythm. It's not like you're not rewarded for a slow rhythm for the most part. I'd imagine that those athletes who are achieving the best marks on that are more likely than not the ones who would be really good at the single leg RSI as well. I imagine if you ran correlations, like it would probably be pretty darn close.
Yeah, and it's interesting because to me, the foot dynamic is going to be different in what we want to see from typically if you're going to perform at a high level on a jump mat with again, looking at RSI, basically trying to, even if not necessarily saying RSI, if we're trying to abbreviate ground contacts, the athlete's probably going to strike the ground with a more 4-foot contact. And versus when we go out and we gallop for height, distance, skip for speed, distance, height, I should say more distance or height, bound for distance or height, certainly distance, I should say, the foot contact is going to be more hind to midfoot. So it's interesting. It's, that's another reason where just looking at the specificity of the challenge, I have found more value in utilizing some methods like that. Even though from a space standpoint, if we were just working in the weight room, a single leg test would work and it would provide a lot of value to us. Still, like I said, there would be some concerns of volume, and we wanted to really control volume and be very, very selective with what type of RSI values and what type of, just general movements we were using with the kids.
Yeah, the way you had talked about setting up that basic test, because thinking about the strategy of how do you end up with the output, with the test you were describing, basically just hopping off a mat onto it, it seems like that would really prioritize forefoot, midfoot power, like as soon as possible versus, like you said, John, you could definitely use a strategy that involves rolling through the heel more for like a skip for height type situation or something like that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even know where to start. Again, you guys are far smarter than I am, but thinking from a standpoint of, it's interesting because there's a relaxation and a time rolling over the foot that has to happen to perform at a high level in some of those movements. That is quite a bit different from a single leg RSI value that we would get if it were for height. It would be amazing to be able to see some of those numbers in terms of contact times on some of those movements. Again, because it looks super abrupt and it looks, if you're looking in real time, as though the athlete is getting off the ground quick, which they are. But the methods to do so are obviously quite a bit different if it's pushing for distance versus a method that's pushing for height.
Yeah. So in terms of contact times and plyometrics, so I guess you could say moving things more towards maybe as opposed to like where gallops and skips and those things are done in a more expansive environment, maybe 20, 30, 40 yards. Things like a hurdle hop or a single leg hurdle hop is a much more compressed environment in terms of space. And if you're looking at contact times, how do you guys go about coaching or referencing contact times? Let's just say it's like a set of hurdle hops or mini hurdle hops or something like that. Whether you have a mat or you don't, like I'm kind of curious because I know for myself, I think about if you don't have something to measure it, I think that it's interesting to think about like just manual references or just getting athletes to reference a spectrum of efforts. I know when I was putting together my master's thesis, which was on depth jumping and then depth jumping over a hurdle or depth jumping up and touching a target like a vertec, and what did that do to ground contact and hip, knee, and ankle torques. I read in doing the literature review, I read a really interesting study that it was basically calculating like max power output in a depth jump, like basically RSI off of a depth jump situation where an athlete dropped down from a box, hit the ground, jumped up. And the study, I think what they did was they had people, I think they had 5 different outcomes. It was either get off the ground as fast as humanly possible at all costs, jump height be damned. And then it was like each next jump was, hey, add a little more jump height, add a little more jump height, add a little bit more jump height. And I think when people have mats, they kind of can play around with that configuration naturally to find, oh, this was the best configuration. But what these researchers found was that when there was no, direct mat feedback for the athletes, they were just given these ground contact time instructions. It wasn't the lowest ground contact that yielded the best power. It was like the second lowest. So it was almost like, it's like be as fast as you can off the ground while still kind of jumping high, like that kind of thing almost. So to me, that's an interesting reference point for when I think about, and I think about too, like John, you talk about like the double bounce or the little hop to big stick stuff where there is like this organic contrasting where people experience little quick, almost as fast as you can hops and then turn it into something with some vertical displacement. It almost allows you to ride that wave in every rep, which I think is really cool and organic. But just that being said, I'm curious what you guys would look at with, if be it on a mat or just instruction to an athlete, what some of your communication lines are for the quality and the time of ground contacts.
Yeah, Rich, I'll take this one first. Just I know you'll segue into some more information. That little hop, big jump is really a perfect way of we've talked before about creating an environment or giving athletes a problem and enabling them to create their own solution with it. So there's a few primary points perhaps that will suggest, but just like you said, the internal rotators are going to internally rotate and the upper body whip athletes are going to upper body whip. And when we do an assessment or when we just simply introduce something like that. So I think it enables the athlete an opportunity to face a challenge and come up with their own solution and how to do so. So anytime we kind of lay something out like that for them, we're able to see how they respond to that coaching feedback, and we're able to see how they respond to that challenge. So I think there's a lot of value in it. And the way that, even if it's just for a teaching point, even if it's just for an opportunity for that young athlete to be able to figure out, okay, if I want to get off the ground a little bit quicker, this is what I need to do. I've said before, I'm not the best with my words of explaining to an athlete how they have to do that. When you have a number that you can tell them to aim for, they're probably going to be able to come up with a solution on their own far better than I would have been able to explain them to get them in that position. So I see a lot of value in it. And it's something that we use. If you were to ask me how often, I'd say we use it on a once a week basis. There might be also sometimes that maybe I'm doing some form of drilling, or again, it might naturally come out in maybe some of our other locomotive plyometrics where I'm telling an athlete to skip for height or gallop for height, but be quicker off the ground, and seeing how they respond to that. So I see a lot of value in it. We use it regularly, even if you don't necessarily have a tool to measure, which is what I like to stress. For many coaches that are in a position like mine at the high school level, they're probably not going to have the opportunity to have some resources that we have. And I understand that. And I think there's a lot of value in just, simply explaining a problem or a challenge to the student athlete. Again, it could be a gallop for height as high as possible, but on this next one, be quicker off the ground, or gallop for height as quick as possible off the ground. And just like you said, height kind of be damned. I think there's a lot of value regardless of, yes, certainly it's helpful if you have a number that an athlete can aim for. You see a lot of competition come out in young kids, which is of course great for a training environment. But there's also some things that you can do without having the tools.
Yeah, I'll keep piggybacking off of that, man. I mean, this is really like the $1 million question of like optimizing anything that we do as coaches. But I'll take the side of like the coach's point of view. So rather like trying to frame what I'm about to say is to also educating the coaches on what we're looking for, because trying to help an athlete when we don't even really know what we're after too is obviously not going to be that helpful. And I'll start by saying this, like RSI in the early years of discovering it through the Just Jump mat taught me more about biomechanics than biomechanics class did, because I thought I knew kind of how the muscle tendon complex worked and what stiffness was and what compliance was from a physics standpoint, but I really didn't understand how important that was with like agility or with really any athletic task in which an athlete is having to stiffen up and flow and just this cycle nonstop. And when we're talking about track athletes, it's a pretty simple, just kind of gait process. But when you're talking about lateral movements, things obviously get a little bit more complicated. And we always, again, will say, man, that athlete is so explosive because of just how well they can have that quick stiffness. That's like insane amounts of force happening at that time to counteract the ground, but then use the ground to their advantage because they're storing so much energy, which is elasticity, in which the three of us can talk all day just on what that means to us. But, the point that I want to make is, in my experience of using this with athletes, I begin to learn more and more and more about what the optimal ground contact time is for the population I was working with. And at the end of the day, like it's all about qualitative movement. Like RSI helps us quantify things for the purpose of qualifying them. Like we always have to remember that the movement quality matters more importantly than anything else, but having that kind of radar gun, if you will, of just measuring how fast that breaking ball was still kind of helps determine if it was a good pitch or not. Or, getting that information on ground contact times on any drill that you do is good. But what happens when you put that radar gun on an athlete and you tell them contact time, they start to just glorify it. And they start to think about it's all about getting that contact time. Like, ooh, I got a 0.09 that time, coach, or a 0.1. I'm like, yeah, that's actually, you look ridiculous doing that. That looks nothing like the actual plyometric task I want you to do, especially if it's cyclical. Like I want it to be under control and consistent. And that's where you, for sure, as a coach, need to identify this is no longer really productive. Cool that my 115-pound soccer player, that's pretty good. 115 pounds exaggerating, but I have had some really small varsity level soccer players that are 5'7", 5'8", weighing 130, who were really good at getting off the ground. Like their contact times were insanely low with whatever task I was having them do, is because they're small. Like they just don't have as much force to deal with. They're really quick. So yes, they're very elastic, but they also are just small. And so just even the context of choosing your depth box height and, recognizing the size of your athlete, like those are the questions that we also need to be asking to say, hey, coach, what's good on this drill for contact time? So, and I get that question a lot, having created the plyomat and having done these drills so many times across the board. The one drill that is my personal favorite for really helping an athlete understand how to be that inflated basketball and how to be really stiff is what I call a speed box hop. So you basically just have a bunch of different heights of boxes. The athlete starts, even, I don't care how athletic you are, I'd like them to start on a 6-inch box. So we're talking, this big, they're starting on top, the mat's behind them, they hop backwards off the mat briefly. We're not talking like a jump backwards off. It's just, I'm hopping off the box and getting right back on. John, have you done this before with some of your athletes, just kind of contact time wise?
Yes, not with the mat though.
Yeah,
So
it's really good just to help them like identify like, oh, all right, so that was quick enough. And here it comes. They're anticipating that the ground is about to get to their feet or vice versa, and they're stiffening up at the right time to get back on. So my most kind of elastic athletes who don't have to think about height because the box is there, the box serves as that, are the ones that, my best athletes are going all the way up to 24 inches. I mean, I have a former athlete of mine. She's a goalkeeper at Ohio State. She's starting right now as a sophomore, and she could do 20 jumps in a row off a 24-inch box without breaking stride, and all of them are like 0.18 or 0.19, and she's just like popping off the ground, like really twitchy, really explosive. Those are the athletes that just can anticipate so well too when that ground is there and to stiffen up at the right time. That's what that drill does for me in terms of like helping an athlete identify that. And if it looks good and you were green on all your reps, meaning, and this gets to my point of setting the contact threshold to 0.2. So 0.2 is kind of what I found as being that cutoff mark for when it's like a little too slow for this particular drill to get them to really do these fast plyometric actions, and then raising the box height if they were able to get 15 or 20, and then going a little higher and going a little higher. So it's a different take than depth drop jumps and depth jumps. It's a lot. It feels pretty natural for the kids because think about all the plyometrics we did when we were younger. Just hop off the bleachers, or something. So I mean, the task itself is pretty simple, but what I like about it is it really only focuses on the ground contact side. They can just understand that part first, and then now you start implementing depth drop jumps and stuff. So I always start with that with an athlete who hasn't really done a lot of plyometric stuff with me first, and that's actually how I even warm them up for a test before we start doing some big time RSI stuff. Where those vertical pogos, man, people don't realize like that's an intense test. Like, you have an athlete that's floating 20 inches in the air, and now they have to anticipate that ground again. Like that's. It's a lot to deal with in a very short period of time that athletes just aren't ready for. That's why they're hopping all over the mat. Like you kind of have to ease them into some of that stuff first. So,
yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the Marv Marinovich style. I think it was his brother Gary who showed me this like 5-6 years ago. Where basically you do that. You're hopping up and down to a box facing it. But then every time you hit the top, you tap the box with one foot. And almost from, I guess from more the art side of doing it or the feeling side versus the data point side, it's hard to do that in a rhythm and not be fast off the ground. Because if you are long on the ground, you instantly lose the rhythm. It's like hop, tap, and it's almost becomes a thing where the pop off the ground kind of has to fit with the tap on the top of the box, if that makes sense. Whatever the leg that comes up.
Yeah. So, Russian hopscotch is what we could call that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good term
really
for it.
Similar. I mean, like, even ladder drills, everybody hates ladders for whatever reason. I mean, it's because you have this trainers that are saying that it's speed work. But in reality, if I don't have a jump mat and I want to see, like, which one of my athletes are pretty elastic and, like, can have optimal ground contact time, like, watch them jump rope, watch them do a ladder drill, watch them do any sort of line drill. I mean, those are the drills that actually help improve like low level elasticity. I mean, those are plyometric tasks and they're happening just so fast. And so again, typically your athletes that can fly through a ladder, like my Division I tennis athletes that were just phenomenal on on a concrete court, that you get them on a ladder, man, they're just flying through that. So many of my court sport athletes who are having to do these, hundreds of quick change of direction tasks over and over and over again in their sport are you're going to be your pretty elastic athletes. And that was what sold me on RSI really early on, is I took that just jump mat and I had a leaderboard going of all Olympic sport athletes at Corpus Christi. And we just had a contest, like who would have the highest RSI by the end of the week. And it was our number one singles player for tennis, Hortense Boscher. This is 8 years ago. I mean, she was a baller and she was lean, so that helped her too. Our soccer forward, that was our best goal scorer. Our Hall of Fame middle blocker that just got indicted or inducted
indicted in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Inducted in the Hall of Fame for Corpus Christi. I mean, those three athletes I will forever remember for the rest of my life. And their RSIs were like 3.2, 3.1. Like they were some of truly our best athletes at the university, three females that were just unbelievable at their sport. And then of course we tested our whole track team, and our best sprinters, jumpers, and hurdlers were scoring the best. So at that point I was like I felt like I discovered Pandora's box. Things got more complicated as time went on, but these athletes could just use the ground to their advantage. I mean, it's the best way I could describe it for people that don't understand RSI. It's like you're helping quantify for an athlete like their relationship with the ground with high forces and high speed. I mean, and a lot of it had a high correlation with trap bar deadlift too. These same female athletes that were scoring really high were some of our highest relative trap bar deadlift scores too. And Stu McGill actually did a research study comparing RSI to core strength, and he had a bunch of different core measures that he used, and it's a published article. I mean, it's core and RSI. Lo and behold, they're highly correlated with each other. I mean, and how Stu McGill measured core, is a little different than others, but there's so many good studies out there just to help us understand this connection between these rapid reactive strength type tasks, which are essentially plyometric in nature, and just overall, strength that an athlete has. So, that's kind of a quick way. I don't know, we're talking about contact time in this question, but just a quick way for people that don't really understand RSI to know that, it's not some just weird, crazy metric out there, but it, from my experience, really helped me identify how athletic my kids were. I mean, just the kids get it, man. They just know that ground is coming and they just can use it. That anticipation is huge.
It's interesting with the core strength piece. I'm assuming because that was bilateral with the Stu McGill talking about that, where I could see that. I know in my own experience, like being at 344 on the jump mat, not as good at high jump and triple jump, but my lifts were pretty good at that time too. Like my total body strength was actually phenomenal. And it's almost like the bilateral is almost more of a total body stiffness. Like, can you instantly generate this? And obviously you're not like stiff like in a cast, but there's things that have to internally rotate, like your legs internally rotating a little bit on the ground. But then that double leg or that single leg, like, well, what changes? You still, I'm sure, need core, but just the output, the changeover going to the foot and the ankle complex is just going through the roof. I was thinking even too about, it's just like the question is, how do you easily measure it, and maybe in non-track populations as well, where maybe they're not as good at bounding, skipping, and galloping. I mean, obviously, it's still great to do it with all athletic populations, but I was even thinking about just doing stuff like a single leg, like Chris Corfist, Dan Fichter, and the InnoSport deal with like the single leg line hops over a battle rope or something like that, or single leg stair hops back and forth on a single leg, where the box has to be pretty low. I think Chris for the forward and back uses like 2 or even only 4 inches. Like it's super low, but it's just foot firing speed. So it's almost like but to measure it, you have to go at least 10, 20, 30 seconds so you can use a stopwatch. You can't just be like, hey, 5 seconds, because the error rate's so high. But it's
nice thing about Plyomat is you can it counts your reps as you go. So if you set it to like 0 reps and you just like there's a guy in the UK that's been doing that right now, and he's like has a son that he's training for track, and he just will have him just go nonstop on one foot just to get and he'll just count how many reps did he get in 10 seconds or something like that. So I mean, that's the thing. We can get into so many different unique protocols for trying to measure this elusive reactive strength thing, unilateral, frontal plane, I mean, there's so many ways to really assess it, but hopefully that anybody that's listening to this episode, can really identify that, man, it truly is a matter of reactive strength. I mean, it's like those two words are, as much as I'm like, well, is it really telling us what it is? Because there's stiffness and elasticity and these other terms that you want to work in with that, but a reactive strength index really does a pretty good job of identifying both of those worlds colliding, of like, how much force am I producing in a short amount of time? I mean, that's the whole goal of it. And as long as we don't get too carried away with using so many different protocols, but stick to just a few and committing to those, then I think we'll find out more of what we really want to know about it, with different populations. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but finding a good unilateral test to do is, I'm still not there yet, and I want to keep exploring that, and I want to keep having these conversations, but you have to start with something. You got to like at least start with one protocol that you like, that you feel like is natural, and sticking with it. And I don't regret using the one that I'm using, because it's really interesting to find out what I'm getting, but I would like to do one that's maybe more cyclical or more horizontal in nature. So, it's not too late to adopt a new protocol. So I may have to do that now.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about, Johnny, you mentioned just giving athletes different experiences, like here, experience fast ground contacts, experience larger ones, and fill in the gaps. And I think,
sure,
it does highlight the way the nervous system learns from all these things. And I think that I don't think I know, and that is the base. Like, especially I've heard like it mentioned, like if you're teaching kids, if you're taking kids through a warm up, you can say, hey, stomp like a monster, this round. All right, now the next one, be light like a ballet dancer or like a cat jumping, and they're experiencing different ways of moving their bodies, more force, less force, more finesse, and all those things. But the thing, I guess, the thing I think about in terms of using a single hit contact time stimulus, I view these all as like information. It's like this spectrum of information that I'm giving to an athlete. And to me, the contact time piece, it's like if we have coordination on one end of it and just pure power output, like neural output and drive on the other, to me, in my opinion, is it fits more on the drive end. Like if I'm doing a workout, and I can only speak with this for myself personally, just because this isn't something that I've done with athletes in in-person training yet, but doing something like using a plyomat or contact mat. Actually, the plyomat, I love it that it's got the two mats. So like putting a hurdle in the middle and put the hurdle up to like a meter or something, and then see how can I max my RSI over this. And in the midst of doing that, I might not be able to go out and do the best like dunk as if I specifically warmed up for dunking using a more coordination strategy or just played pickup basketball. But how I feel a few days after that workout, I'm jumping better. I'm my output. It's almost like, for me, it's like when we go into the single contacts, it's more on the output side of things, raw. And it's a perspective that I think you only get when you have the number in some senses. That's not to say that you can't get to a very high level doing all the other exploration, but I just think that's my opinion of where, at least in the sense of the workout itself, as that's added on. I'd be curious, you guys' perspective on that balance. I know we're running out of time a little bit too, but I'd be curious about the balance of those perspectives with coordination and just more global stuff, the task orientation, like do these skips for this distance and how many, versus something that's way more compressed. Just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the more compressed, like single or double jumps, I feel like the less jumps, athletes can disguise some things.
Yeah.
I think the more, again, to me, I'm a pretty visual person. I'm a track and field minded person. I like seeing things kind of happen over space. And I feel like it's very hard. It's way more difficult to disguise things on some of those things that we do over a distance versus a single hop. Similarly, in the same breath, although obviously in a very different way, I feel like when you go through multiple hops, the more multiple hops that you have, the more cyclical it is in nature, the tougher it is for athletes to disguise things, because it's the reality of the way they're moving and the way they're responding to the ground. So I still think there's, like I said, that's our primary value that we still assess, is how quickly we can get off the ground in that single small hop to a big jump. But there's a lot to be said and a lot of value in the more, repeat hops that you do, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I even think about like Olympic weightlifting in that context of like quantitative versus qualitative, like anything that you have that is so skill dominant, there's so much timing involved, and you have that, like what I was alluding to earlier, this understanding of biomechanics of stiffness and compliance. Like when do the muscles relax versus when do they stiffen up? And the Plyomat and Reactive Strength Index identifies hopefully both of like the hang time, the flight time of when my body really is in displacement and when I am relaxed, and then also the key moment of stiffness, also measured in time of how little time did I spend to achieve that. But the task will always be the most important thing. Our job as athletic development people that are using this piece of technology to get our athletes more elastic is to almost compress it as much as possible so that we can score it well and consistently know that what we're trying to measure is actually getting measured. And that's where my brain goes, almost like opposite of John's. John's trying to like really expand this out. And Joel, you know, listening to you over the years, like you really try and absolutely connect this with the global movement, and then you know the cognitive aspect of what's being seen and felt and heard. Whereas my brain always goes to like, how can I put this in a box and like really identify what I'm looking for? And I think both are good, both are healthy, because it is just so hard to measure almost anything with the human body. I mean, if I'm really trying to just remove as many variables as possible, like with using the force plates to measure counter movement jump, like I put a stick on the kid's shoulders, or we put hands on hips. Why do we do hands on hips? And that's a whole nother conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I get asked that all the time. It's like, and John and I were talking about this earlier. Do we want to free the kids up to like use their arms, or do we want to lock them down and go hands on hips, which feels awkward? But that's exactly kind of what we're talking about in this discussion of the two perspectives. It's like, do I really want to isolate what I'm trying to measure right now, which is lower body power or lower body bilateral reactive strength? Or do I want to let the athlete kind of just own the movement and explore their own strategy for finding that? And so I think both are healthy. The problem is making the decision on kind of one way or the other, like not just being right on the fence of it. When we're talking about athletic assessment, like if I'm really trying to assess a quality, I need to be decisive on kind of what part of that fence I'm looking for, and being okay with it shifting either way, and letting an athlete kind of being free, even because that's just what they chose as their strategy to try and score high. I mean, like that was their best effort. And then it's now up to us as global specialists to say, all right, that was acceptable or that was unacceptable. Just think about all the power cleans we see on Twitter and everywhere else of like, all right, he had a pretty decent catch and he was in the front rack and he didn't look like he was about to fall over and die. Like, you know, that one video that was circling around, everybody was all upset about, you know, I think it was the Penn State, you know, lifter doing a heavy power clean and he's kind of falling backwards, but he pushed it back in time. And, you know, half of Twitter's like, that was awesome, great lift. And the other half of Twitter, who's like you know, who loves Olympic weightlifting, is like, that was awful, you're going to hurt the kid. So, I mean, just really deciding, like, is getting the weight up more important as measuring his ability to really be explosive and have great lower body power and do this power clean, or is it the power clean itself? And I don't know if that's quite where you wanted that question to go, Joel, on that perspective, but that's what comes to my mind as I tried to tote that line to do it in a way where I am finding out this quality and what score that they're getting, so I can know that I'm improving that athlete's ability to do that without sacrificing the qualitative side. I mean, that's one of the toughest things with assessment, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting spectrum and all valid and important things to train along all lines of that coordination, more global coordination, all the way down into compressing it down into key core abilities where those single contacts and more depth jump type stimuli come out. So, hey, I know we're running out of time here though. I'd love to ask a few more questions. I know we're going to get a little bit into some of the details of RSI, but just before we get out of here too, maybe just in a minute or less, if you guys have any closing thoughts or anything you had wanted to mention throughout the course of the conversation.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is, and I told Joe, I was like, it'd be cool if we could mention this at the end. I'll do it in less than 30 seconds, but whatever technology you use to measure RSI and that I've used in the past, just know that they're different. And then the ground contact times that you get with the plyomat are more sensitive than the just jump mat, and for reasons that we don't have to have time to go in now. But but the standards are going to be different. But the most important thing, if we are really using this technology to like find out more about our athletes, is that we're consistently using that technology with our population and collecting that data and being smart with that data and establishing standards. So I've got plenty of standards up to this point for Plyomat. I've got plenty of standards with the Just Jump mat too, as well as force plates. So just kind of acknowledging that each piece of technology is going to give you slightly different scores, because the electronics are different, simply put.
Yeah, and I think a couple things. Certainly, Rich touched on it earlier. I think being able to quantify something that's qualitative, I think, is really cool, and that's a value of measuring RSI. Being able to, I feel like I've learned so much about how our student athletes move and how they're probably going to move when they sprint, how they're probably going to move when they're on a jump runway, how they're probably going to move when they're changing direction on a football or soccer field. We've found a lot of information about that just simply by introducing some RSI type of measurements, and especially more specifically focusing on those ground contact times, seeing how the athletes respond and how the athletes move. So I think there's a lot of value there. That's one way I would encourage, one reason I would encourage coaches to utilize the technology, or more important, just the task. And similarly, I think for me, Rich, Joel, we've talked about it so many times, just context is so big for me. And I think it adds context, and it adds intent, and it enables opportunities to have conversations with young student athletes to simplify things that seem so kind of like obscure probably to them. They don't understand necessarily immediately what these numbers are, but when you can discuss to them what those numbers are, what they measure, and why we're using it, there's so much value in that. And I've had so many great conversations with some of our young student athletes about why we're using a drill, why there's some benefits to a gallop for speed, why they're having some success on a triple jump runway or not. And being able to use these numbers to kind of tie it all together has been immensely beneficial. So first and foremost, I certainly appreciate Rich for introducing it to me in many ways, and certainly educating me on the matter. But I also appreciate you guys being able to talk to two friends and spend the day together to be able to talk is pretty darn awesome. So I certainly want to say a thank you to you both.
Well, thank you. Bro. Yeah, thank you guys for being on. Hey, I really appreciate it, Rich and John.
Yeah, of course.
Cool.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. I appreciate you being here. And I wanted to let you know also that this podcast is sponsored by the Plyomat. I'm sure you've heard it mentioned throughout the podcast today. Of course, there's a ton of great training information in this podcast that you don't need a contact mat for. But if you do want to take your training to that level where you're gathering that data and getting that instant feedback that a training switch mat can provide you, the Plyomat is an awesome option. Thanks again for listening. Appreciate you being here, and we'll see you next week.